People ask me about that evening every so often. My colleagues at the university, the ones who were there, bring it up at retirement dinners and departmental farewells, usually after the second glass of wine, usually with the same half-smile that says, "You remember, don't you?" And I always do. I should tell you that I am not a musical man. 41 years in the chemistry department, reactions, molecular bonds, the disciplined language of what holds things together and what tears them apart, had given me very little education in what happens inside a concert hall. I attended the music faculty's annual formal dinner that November because the dean, Philip Haverstock, had been a friend since our early days as junior lecturers, and because he'd said, simply, "Come, Jeffrey, there's a fine pianist speaking, and the food won't embarrass us." I went, as I always did when Philip asked, and I sat at the long table beneath the portrait of the college's founder, and I ate my salmon, and I understood perhaps a third of the conversation around me. The Founders' Hall was at its best that evening. Candles in the iron candelabra above the tables, the old paneling the color of dark honey in the light, and at the far end of the room, on a low dais, the Bosendorfer. It stood there the way a great instrument always stands in a formal room, present without insisting on itself, waiting, entirely aware that it is the most significant object in the space. The guest of honor was a pianist named Roland Crew. I knew the name only because Philip had briefed me on the drive over, a recitalist of some standing, a man who had performed in the major concert halls of Europe and whose recordings occupied a prominent shelf in Philip's office. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of careful self-containment that men of significant reputation sometimes cultivate. He spoke before dinner on the responsibilities of the interpretive artist, and he spoke well, though I confess I followed the argument only in outline. He was seated 3 chairs to my left, and during dinner, he was animated, holding court on questions of romantic repertoire and the habits of certain conductors, and the table listened with the attentiveness that famous visitors always command. I noticed the girl early in the evening. She was young, 22, perhaps 23, and she moved through the room with the practiced quietness of someone who has learned to be unobtrusive in the presence of people who regard her as furniture. She was clearing the side tables, collecting the first-course glasses, keeping the room tidy in the way that college domestics do at these occasions, efficiently, invisibly. She wore the college's dark uniform, and her hair was pinned back, and she had a small, serious face that gave nothing away. At some point, we were between courses, the conversation had grown loud and self-satisfied. She came close to the Bosendorfer to collect a glass someone had set on the corner of the dais. She was not touching the instrument. She was simply near it, reaching past it, and as she did, she hummed, barely audible, a phrase of something, 4 or 5 bars, a passage of considerable harmonic complexity, delivered under her breath, as naturally as another woman might hum a pop song. I caught it. The man beside me caught it, and Crew, 2 tables away, caught it. He turned his head. "What was that?" he said, not unkindly at first, simply curious. The girl stopped. She stood with the glass in her hand and looked at him, and she did not look afraid. She looked as though she had been caught doing something private. "What were you humming just then?" Crew said. The table had gone quieter. There were perhaps 40 of us in the room. "The Fantasy," she said. "The Schumann. The opening of the development section." A small silence. Someone at the far table laughed softly. I saw Crew's expression shift. Not unkind, precisely, but amused, the way a man of long professional experience is amused by a confident answer from an unexpected source. "You know it well, do you?" he said. "I know it," she said. Crew looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the table, and there was something performative in the look, the gathering of an audience. He set down his wine glass. "Well," he said, "go on then. Play something simple for us. Give us the melody, if you think you can. We could do with a little music while they bring the dessert." The table laughed. Not cruelly. It was not a cruel group of people, but indulgently, the way an audience laughs at the setup of a joke they expect to enjoy. Philip, beside me, was smiling in a way that I would later recognize as watchful. Most of the room assumed what I assumed, that the girl would demur, that she would smile and shake her head and retreat to the side table, and that the moment would pass. She set the glass down on the tray. Then she walked to the Bosendorfer and sat down. The bench height was wrong. It was set for a taller player, and she adjusted it without looking at her hands. 2 full turns of the knob, the same unhurried competence she'd brought to the wine glasses. The room was still talking. Crew had half turned back to his neighbor. Someone was pouring wine at the far end of the table. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment. Just a moment. Then she set them on the keys and played the opening chord of the Schumann Fantasy in C major. I cannot tell you what it sounded like in technical terms. I am a chemist. I know what resonance means in one context. What it means in that room, that evening, with that instrument and those hands, is not something I was equipped to describe. What I can tell you is that the sound was not soft. It was not a melody offered as a party piece. It was the fantasy. As I later learned, it had to be played. Enormous. Urgent. The opening declaration of something that knows it has waited long enough. The opening statement arrived like a door thrown open, wide and absolute and beyond negotiation. The Bosendorfer answered her as though it had been waiting for exactly this. Perhaps it had. These instruments are old. They have heard everything, and learned to distinguish. The room went quiet, one table at a time. I watched it happen. The far table first, the laughter dying as the phrase continued. As it became clear, this was not a little tune, not a party trick, not the modest offering of a girl who'd had a few lessons. Then the middle tables, the cutlery going still, the wine mid-pour. Then the table nearest the dais, 2 of the music faculty's senior lecturers, turning in their chairs to look at her properly. I heard a woman somewhere behind me draw in her breath. And Crew. He had turned back to his neighbor, as I said. Then he stopped. He turned around slowly, not quickly, not dramatically, and he looked at her. He did not touch his wineglass again. She played from memory. Her eyes were not closed. That is the detail I remember most clearly, because in films and in imagination, people always close their eyes when the music takes them over, and she did not. Her eyes were open, steady, focused somewhere in the middle distance beyond the instrument, as if she were reading something written in the air in front of her. There was no performance in her posture, no exhibitionism, no leaning, no visible effort to impress, only the contained efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times, in private, in a kitchen, and finds no reason to behave differently now that the room has changed. The development section came, the passage she had hummed, the harmonically vertiginous passage that had caught Crew's attention, and she played it as though she had lived inside it for years, which, I later learned, she had. The first movement of the fantasy is long. It does not apologize for its length. It builds and retreats, and builds again, in a way that asks something of the listener. Attention, patience, a willingness to follow. In that room, we followed. I think all 40 of us followed without quite understanding we were doing it. I stopped being aware of my own body. I stopped being aware of the candles and the portrait and the paneled walls, and Philip beside me. I am told afterward that I had laid my napkin down on the table at some point during the performance, and had not picked it up again. I have no recollection of doing this. There was only the music and the girl and the Bosendorfer, and the particular quality of the silence that had formed around all 3 of them, a silence that was not empty, but full, the way a held breath is full. When she reached the long, quiet passage near the end of the movement, the music subsiding to something tender, almost private, the thunder resolved into something intimate and still, I was aware that the woman to my right had her hand pressed flat against the tablecloth, though she did not seem aware of it. A man near the window, one of the senior faculty, had his head bowed. Philip was very still. The final bars came. The movement does not end triumphantly. It ends with a kind of settled, earned quiet, like a question that has been answered so completely it no longer needs to be spoken. She played the last chord and held it. Then her hands left the keys and returned to her lap, and the sound faded into the room. For a moment, not a long moment, but a real one, nobody in that hall moved or spoke. Then Philip stood. Then the room stood, not quickly, not in a rush, the way a room rises when it doesn't entirely understand what has happened to it, but knows, with the certainty of the body rather than the mind, that something has. The sound of 40 people rising at once and beginning to applaud is a particular sound. I have heard it only once in my life. I was on my feet. I didn't remember standing. Across the room, I watched Crew. He had not stood with the rest of us. He remained in his chair for a moment, the whole room applauding around him and Crew still seated, his hands on the tablecloth, his expression one that I had not seen on his face at any point during the evening, or during his polished pre-dinner remarks, or during the assured conversation over the salmon. He looked as if something had been taken away from him, very gently and without malice, and he was in the process of deciding whether to be diminished by the fact or enlarged by it. Then he stood. He walked around the table, unhurried, through the applauding room. He walked to the dais, and he stopped in front of her as she rose from the bench. He held out his hand. She took it. "Where did you study?" he said. I was close enough to hear him clearly, not because he raised his voice, but because the applause was beginning to settle, the room finding its way back from wherever the music had taken it. "My grandmother's kitchen," she said. "She was a piano teacher. She died 3 years ago." Crew looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "She must have been extraordinary." "She thought so of you," the girl said, and that was all. Her name, I learned afterward, was Cecily Oakes. She had been a student at the university for 2 years, enrolled in the biochemistry program of all things, which Philip found delightful, and which I found gave me a mild, unearned pride in the girl, and she had worked the faculty dinners for 2 years to cover her fees, moving through rooms of musicians and composers, and celebrated visiting artists without once being asked what she could do. Her grandmother, a woman named Ruth Oakes, had given lessons for 40 years in a small house in the east of the city, and had passed the Schumann fantasy to her granddaughter, the way some people pass down a piece of jewelry, with the understanding that the recipient will know what it is worth, even if no one else can see it. Ruth had taught her the piece, section by section across 3 years, beginning when Cecily was 16, and had made her promise, at the end, to keep practicing. She had kept the promise. She had kept it in her grandmother's kitchen after Ruth died, then in a practice room she booked at 6 in the morning before her shifts began, then wherever she could find a piano and the time. 3 years of keeping a promise to someone who could no longer hear her honor it. I do not know what became of Crew after that evening. I know he spoke to Philip the following morning, and I know that Philip made a telephone call that week to the head of the music faculty's performance program, and I know that the nature of that conversation was not reported to me in full. I know that Cecily Oakes finished her biochemistry degree. I know that is not all she did. I have thought about that evening many times in the years since I retired. I spent my career measuring what holds things together, the covalent bond, the ionic lattice, the molecular geometry of things that cohere. I thought I had a reasonable understanding of how forces work and what constitutes a structure strong enough to last. I know something more now. It is harder to put into the language of my discipline. It has to do with what a person can carry in silence for a long time, and what happens to a room when they finally set it down.